Hello YouTube, welcome back to my channel. For those of you new here, my name is Allie and today I'm sharing with you my bow setup for elk season. So this is actually the same setup that I used all last season for elk, although I did not kill an elk, and for whitetail, and I did kill a whitetail. And that whitetail experience was actually really interesting and told me a lot about what my setup is doing. So I'll share that experience with you a little bit later. But first, a disclaimer, I'm not a professional. I am simply sharing what my setup is with you guys, just to get that out of the way. I don't want there to be any confusion because, you know, sometimes on the internet it can be confusing. Now, jumping into it, first thing I want to talk about is the specs of the bow. So this is the PSE EVO NXT 33. The 33 means that it has a 33-inch axle to axle. And I have found that I love a longer axle to axle bow, frankly, because they are more stable, and that stability is what helps me improve my accuracy. When you're at full draw, it's very, very stable and you can execute a better shot that way. And that is, to me, more important than the gains that I would get with speed with a lower axle to axle bow. So if you don't know, longer axle to axle is going to be more stable, but slower. A smaller axle to axle is going to be faster, but less stable. So you just kind of have to figure out what works best for you and what you like. My Matthews Avail, which was the bow that I was shooting before this, had a much shorter axle to axle. And I don't remember exactly what that was, but I will put it on the screen now. I did love that bow, but I do think that my accuracy suffered because of the shorter axle to axle. This bow has a 7-inch brace height, and anything over like 6.5 inches is considered long when it comes to brace heights. Now, brace heights, similarly to ATA, are going to affect your accuracy. So a longer brace height bow typically is more accurate than shorter brace height. And the draw cycle is going to be a little smoother on a longer brace height. But the con to a longer brace height is the speed again. So longer brace height means a slower bow. My specs, I'm about 5'8", and I have got a 28.5-inch draw length, which is very long, especially for a female, but for really anybody. And I pull about 52 pounds. Technically, it's clocking in a little higher than 52, but for conversation's sake, we'll say 52, which is very, very low compared to most of the people that you see on the internet creating this type of content, which is exactly why I wanted to share this setup. Because of the experience that I had last year with it, I feel really good about it. So that's why I wanted to share it. So for any of you out there with shorter draw lengths or small draw weights, I feel you. And that's what I designed this setup for my low poundage. Speaking of poundage, there's an interesting story behind how I landed on 52. I have been trying to work on a high elbow draw cycle for a number of reasons. One being my shoulder health, and two being creating a more consistent routine prior to my shot so that I am more accurate. You feel me? Because like the number one thing that you can do in archery to be better and more accurate is doing the same exact thing every single time. So there's a benefit to having a high elbow because it's less movement, there's less things going on, and you know, you can therefore create that more consistent draw cycle before you shoot. But the downside of a high elbow is that you can't pull as much weight. And for me, hunting elk in particular, and other big game species, it's more important to me that I'm able to draw 5 extra pounds or more, maybe even 6 or 7 extra pounds with a low elbow versus the high elbow. Now, one of the things that is concerning is shoulder health. And way back when, I used to struggle with my shoulders a lot. Thankfully, they have been good as of recent. I've done some work with my posture. I exercise a lot, so I always am doing exercises to improve the strength of my shoulders, improve the mobility of my shoulders. But point is, my shoulders are in a good place, and frankly, I'm a hunter, and this setup is for hunting versus, you know, target archery. That's an entire different world. I'm in no competitions but with myself and the animal, really. So I found that currently, right now, the low elbow is working for me. And I like being able to shoot a slightly faster bow because I can have a slightly heavier arrow, which is going to give me more penetration. And the arc, like the actual trajectory of my arrow is, honestly, it still sucks. It sucks. What I mean is, I want my arrow to fly as flat as possible. You know, like the faster your bow is, the flatter that arrow path will be. But my arrow path is like, ding, you know? And when my poundage is even lower, it's really, really bad. So it's working for me right now, and I'm happy with what's going on. But just know that I don't think that's the best solution for everybody. I do feel like it's the right solution for me. Now let's talk arrows. Yeah, so I built these arrows last year, and they are the Easton Axis 5mm arrows. They're a carbon arrow, but they're relatively heavy for carbon arrows. I can't remember the GPI, but I will put that on the screen for you now. That GPI stands for grains per inch. So the higher that number, the heavier the arrow will be per inch. I glued in a 50 grain brass insert, which gives me a higher FOC, or front of center, which can help with penetration. And then I paired that with a fixed blade 100 grain broadhead. And I put a quick fletch on the back of it. It is 3 fletch, quick fletch. And those have been holding up great. I've had them like that for a year, and I may have damaged 1 out of 7 or 8 arrows. I have an HHA single pin Tetra. It is a single pin adjustable. So I have a little wheel that I spin to set the yardage, except going back to like this poundage thing and my heavy arrows and the poor trajectory of my bow, I had to create my own tape for this sight because it is so slow. So I had to sight in at 20 yards, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45. And I don't think I can really go much further than that before my sight housing starts to hit the broadhead or the shaft of the arrow itself. I love a single pin because of the sight picture. I like to see a single pin on top of the animal that I'm about to shoot at. And I practice with my bow enough that if my pin is set at 20 and the deer runs to 25, that I can sort of manually adjust myself and execute that shot without having to fumble with my sight, like if I'm already at full draw, for example. I prefer that over having 3 or 5, or some people have 7 pins. It's just not my thing. A single pin with the clean clarity is where it's at for me. I'm using a Scott molded grip release. I used to shoot a wrist strap, and then Nick and I got married in the Florida Keys, and while we were there, I was feeding tarpon at Robbie's, which is in Islamorada. If you don't know, now you know. And the tarpon came up and ate the fish and ate my arm. And now I have these scars on my arm that I don't think will ever go away, but it was right before elk season last year, and they were still healing, so I couldn't put a wrist strap on. So I kind of had to use this Scott molded release, but I ended up loving it. I love it so much. I think my accuracy has improved with it. I still slap the trigger like crazy. Sometimes, you know, some shots are better than others, but I feel like it's just forgiving and nice, and I love it. I've tried hinge releases, I've tried thumb buttons, back tension. It just, everybody has their thing, and thankfully I found mine with this Scott release. Not saying that I won't change to something else in the future, but for right now, I love it. Couldn't be happier with it. I'm currently using the Quivalizer, so it acts as my stabilizer and my quiver. And at first, I loved it. Once I started hunting with it, honestly, I didn't really love it anymore, which made me sad because I think the idea is brilliant and I think in practice it does really well. But for me, having a stabilizer that long on it during elk season in the mountains was just like too much. And then during whitetail season, I definitely couldn't sit in a tree stand or sit in a saddle with this huge stabilizer hanging off the front of it, which is why actually in the video when I shot my buck, I didn't have any stabilizer on my bow, first of all. And I didn't have any quiver on my bow because the Quivalizer was in my pack because it was too big and frankly annoying to have on my bow while I was actually hunting from a saddle, which is why after I shot the deer and I was going for a second arrow, I was kind of fumbling around. So I need to buy something before this season, and I don't know what I'm gonna buy yet, so if you have suggestions, leave them down below, but I will be doing that over the next couple of weeks before it's actually game time. So like I mentioned, I killed a deer with this exact setup, these exact arrows, my exact release last year. And the shot was at 40 yards from a saddle, and the deer had no clue I was there. So my extra movement in my draw cycle was no big deal. But to be fair, I did a very good job of like choosing a tree to set myself up in. I was kind of like wrapped in a pine tree. So in terms of setup, I think that was mostly why. And I shot the deer and it was immediately sick, started wobbling around, and then I watched him lay down and die 10 yards from where I originally shot him. And when I got up to the deer and I was examining the arrow, I did not get a full pass through. And by the looks of it, the arrow slid pretty much cleanly between two ribs. So I didn't even break any rib bones as the arrow was entering, and I still didn't get a full pass through. But what I did get was a heck of a lot of damage once that arrow got in that deer. It was like it got stuck into him and just like ripped it up. Not to be like graphic or whatever, but the amount of damage was insane. And that's what ultimately killed the deer so fast. Like normally I've had deer, if you shoot them in the lungs, even, you know, with like a rifle, they just like kick and run and then they'll die, you know, a little farther away. But this guy didn't run anywhere. And of course, every situation's different, but the point that I'm getting at is I feel like the heavy arrow with the heavier FOC was so critical to the way that that arrow impacted that animal and the amount of damage that it did. And that's why I'm sticking with this exact setup for elk, because that's what I designed it for last year. And based on what it did to the whitetail, I feel good about it ripping through a heavier hide on an elk and hopefully doing the same exact thing. Hopefully lodging itself in there and then stirring it around. I want to stress this again before I close this video out. Everybody's bow setup is going to be different. I just wanted to share this because I have a low poundage and I have a like clear case study from my deer last year on this exact setup that I think is interesting information for someone else, either choosing a bow or building out a bow or what have you, who also has a low poundage. So yeah, so if you guys have questions or comments, leave them down below. I always, always, always welcome feedback. And that's it, you guys. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.